Tonight on The Story, what are normally small-time races in local government are escalating beyond county lines because of voter fraud claims.
We actually don't own our own voter registrations. It's done by a third-party company by the name of Audit. It's Electronic Registration Information Center. It was seed funded by George Soros' Open Society in 2011.
Tonight, we're fact-checking claims made by a candidate in the Auditor's race in Clark County. Plus, a one-on-one with Commissioner Joanne Hardesty on how she would handle the homeless crisis if re-elected.
I would actually create a work group and say, how are we going to address this issue?
And finally,
the saying about Gallagher is that he's the only man legally hanged in Clark County.
Mystery, fascination, and eventual public condemnation over a so-called hanging holiday in 1890. We have a thrilling preview of the newest episode of KGW's Wicked West podcast. Here's The Story. I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. We're less than a week away from the election now, and as we get closer, those who want you to believe the election system cannot be trusted are really getting worked up. It's happening around the country and right here in Clark County. And that's our big story tonight. We spend a lot of time covering the high-profile races ahead of Election Day. Think Oregon governor and various congressional races on the ballot. But some of the smaller, rather mundane positions got our attention because of false claims of voter fraud. That leads us to the auditor's race in Clark County, where voters will decide who should supervise the county's elections for the next 4 years. Investigative reporter Evan Watson fact-checks claims of voter fraud made by candidate Brett Simpson, who is challenging longtime auditor Greg Kimsey.
At a campaign rally for Republican congressional candidate Joe Kent, Clark County Auditor candidate Brett Simpson told voters that election fraud is rampant.
So now you can see the scale of the fraud that is taking place in the state of Washington. Here in Clark County, we didn't quite shoot the moon like Snohomish did, but we ended up with over 90% of all printed ballots returned. It's an impossibility. It's completely out of the normal, and it's completely out of the historics of voting in the United States.
But the certified vote totals don't back that up, and there is no evidence of voter fraud in Clark County, as Simpson claims. About 85% of registered voters in Clark County voted in the 2020 presidential election. Similarly, 85% of voters cast their ballots in 2008, as Barack Obama and John McCain squared off. About 77% turned out in 2016. We asked County Auditor Greg Kimsey, who both oversees the county's election results and is running against Simpson for re-election, for his response to Simpson's numerous claims of voter fraud.
One being the amount of ballots returned in 2020 was an impossibility. It was too many here in Clark County. Why are you smiling?
Because it's just so patently not true. The returns in the 2020 were not at all abnormal.
Kimsey says he's astounded that people continue to believe disproven claims about widespread election fraud.
Misinformation about elections undermines people's confidence in the results of elections, which is a direct threat to our democracy.
At the Kent campaign event, one of Simpson's statements received a bigger reaction than the rest.
We actually don't own our own voter registrations. It's done by a third-party company by the name of Audit. It's Electronic Registration Information Center. It was seed funded by George Soros' Open Society in 2011.
Let's break down Simpson's statement here. First off, what is ERIC? ERIC's made up of a coalition of 33 states and Washington, D.C. It reviews voter rolls to help make sure they're accurate and up to date. Because many people don't remember to update their voter registration when they move states, or because people die, ERIC provides reports to states to help them prevent potential voter fraud. ERIC's also been the subject of conspiracy theories from far-right media this year. Washington's elections director says simply, ERIC's just a huge help.
So to say that ERIC is doing anything is misleading. It's providing us with data and information that we would otherwise not have in order to increase the integrity of the voter registration roll. So it's a tool that we need as election administrators to ensure that people that are registered in another state get removed from their voter rolls in our state.
The state of Washington was one of 7 states of both Republican and Democratic leadership that started ERIC in 2012. As for Simpson's claims about George Soros, the billionaire philanthropist, his Open Society foundations gave a one-time $500,000 contribution to Pew Charitable Trusts. Pew is a national, nonpartisan nonprofit that receives more than $300 million in grants annually. Pew provided startup funding for ERIC in 2012, but ERIC has been funded by the member states ever since. It's up to the individual states to submit voter registration and licensing data to ERIC, and then use any ERIC reports to then check and manage their own voter lists.
So we end up with much better voter registration rolls, much cleaner, much more accurate voter registration rolls with ERIC than without ERIC.
Now, I'd like to share my reporting process for this story. I saw Brett Simpson speak at a recent campaign event and recorded these comments. I then talked with the Washington Secretary of State's office and the ERIC organization. Then I asked Clark County Auditor and Simpson's opponent, Greg Kimsey, for his response. Then yesterday, I sent a message to Brett Simpson explaining this process and how I had researched and then refuted some of his claims about fraudulent elections. I asked Simpson if he'd like to add or clarify anything from his statements. He didn't respond to that email. However, this afternoon, Brett Simpson did post a video on his Facebook page. He said that this report would be a hit piece of gaslighting from the mainstream media. He also criticized media attention on this county auditor's race, calling it literally unprecedented. However, Simpson did not respond to my questions about his false claims about ERIC or the voter turnout from the 2020 presidential election. So, Pat, that's how we got here. I should add that the state of Washington's elections director also said that these claims of voter fraud are proven false at this point.
Okay, and just to remind people, he's running for a position called Auditor, but in fact, he's going to be in charge of elections.
Yes, the county auditor position is the chief financial officer for the county, but also the main role that most people know is overseeing the accountable, fair, accurate elections process.
And is there anyone else running? Is it just him and the incumbent?
In the Clark County voters pamphlet, it's just those two individuals, Greg Kimsey, who you saw, and Brett Simpson, who you both saw in this story.
Okay, interesting reporting. Thanks, Evan. By the way, I also wanted to share my opinion on this, and like I said, it's my opinion. You can agree or not. But in my 37 years as a journalist, 32 of them here at KGW, I've seen a fair number of politicians from time to time hide behind the false narrative of being persecuted by the media. I think it's one of the lamest excuses out there. It's an attempt to dodge responsibility and accountability for what they say. We have legitimate questions about Brett Simpson's claims, and they deserve answers. But instead of responding to our reporter, Evan, he hides behind a Facebook video and paints himself as the victim. He's not the victim. He's also not the first to do that, and I'm sure he won't be the last. But don't be misled by his claims of a massive media conspiracy. We simply want to ask him to defend his wild claims because there might be someone out there who actually believes what he says. The fact that he won't talk to our reporter speaks volumes. That's my opinion. What do you think? You don't have to agree with me, but you should communicate. Send me an email. This address is thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. I look forward to hearing from you. More and more of you are getting those ballots sent in to make sure your voice is heard in this midterm election. We've been taking a look at ballot return numbers each day this week, and we're going to change the way we do it tonight, and it's because of your feedback. Paul wrote in last night to say, I usually enjoy your program, but reporting all those county and state balloting percentages is boring, and it means nothing to me. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Paul. But then after that, Joan wrote in to say, talking about our segment, saying, the way you finished your show tonight was fabulous, taking part in our ritual of democracy. Our democracy cannot be stressed or mentioned enough. Thank you, Joan. And we are checking on the ballot returns to do just that, see how many people have already taken part in this ritual of democracy. But Paul, we hear you too. So instead of looking at the top 3 and bottom 3 counties in each state, we're going to give a statewide picture and then hone in on some of the counties here in the KGW viewing area instead. Here's a broad look at Oregon. So far, more than 630,000 people have sent in their ballots, making up about 21% of the nearly 3 million registered voters. 1 in 5 voters, or 20% in Washington County, are done with their ballots. That's about 77,000 people. Clackamas County isn't too far behind with 18.4% of the ballots returned. That's about 57,000 people. And here in Multnomah County, which holds the largest number of eligible voters in Oregon, we're at about 15.6% of ballots returned. That's about 88,000 people who have voted so far. All right, Washingtonians? Well, over 1 million ballots have been sent in, making up just over 22% of all people who are eligible statewide. Clark County is behind in the statewide percentage, down at 18.3%, though that does still total about 60,000 people. 1 in 4 voters in Cowlitz County, 25%, made their choice and sent their ballot in already. That's about 18,000 votes. Over in Skamania County, over 22% of the ballots are in, but due to the size of Skamania County, that's only about 2,000 people. So there you have it. Now look at the ballot returns so far. Just as we sit 6 days from Tuesday, November 8th, it's going to be a really big day. What are your thoughts? Do you like this version better? I'm looking at you, Paul. Or is this just a bunch of numbers that you could care less about still? We would like to hear from you. Again, our email is thestory@kgw.com, or you can call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Now to the city of Portland, where one council seat is up for election next Tuesday. Commissioner Joanne Hardesty is running to retain her seat, and challenger Rene Gonzalez is hoping to take it away. Last week, we heard from Gonzalez and how he would handle the city's homeless crisis. Tonight, it's Hardesty's turn. Our Blair Best will join us in a few minutes with her takeaways from both interviews. But first, let's hear what Hardesty would do about the crisis if she is reelected.
That what we see on our
Portland City Council Commissioner Joanne Hardesty calls the crisis on our streets misery.
And my biggest fear is that it's only going to get worse in January.
So Portlanders across the board believe there needs to be change in the city's response to this crisis. What in your eyes isn't working with how the city responds? What would you do differently if reelected, and why haven't you done it already?
Well, let me just say I've never had the Housing Bureau in my portfolio. I don't supervise the Joint Office of Houseless Services. But what I would do, what I think should happen differently, because of my leadership, Commissioner Dan Vine is in a position to renegotiate the intergovernmental agreement with the next Multnomah County chairperson. If I was a queen of the universe for a day and had housing, I would immediately, after the November elections, convene a meeting with the next governor, the next county chair, and our federal delegation, and I would actually create a work group and say, how are we going to address this issue?
Mayor Wheeler's homeless plan to build 3 large homeless campuses over an 18-month period and ban unsanctioned camping. You said you were disappointed with the lack of details in funding and that it needs to be more urgent. Can you explain your stance on this, and what do you propose that they do differently?
Well, the mayor wants to take 18 months to develop a plan to get funding and to launch the first whatever he's calling those camps. If there's a sense of urgency, and again, what's come in front of us has no dollars attached to it, no plan about how we accomplish it, no sites already pre-selected. So if there's this real sense of urgency, and this isn't just a political stunt, we should have much more detail, and we should actually be on a much faster track.
One of the amendments that you're suggesting is having the 3 large camping sites spread across the city, not in just one targeted neighborhood. Do you have any examples of where those could be?
Let me just say that I am not supporting 500-person camps anywhere. What I know is that normally 40 to 60 people should be the maximum. I think the mayor would find it impossible to find a place where the community would welcome 500 houseless people living together willy-nilly.
You say in your 3 years on council you've accomplished the highly effective Portland Street response that reduces the workload on the Portland Police Bureau. However, those workers are inundated with calls. Last month they received the most amount of calls they ever have, and they still have to return some of those calls to the Portland Police Bureau.
Yes, as you know, we are still rolling out Portland Street Response citywide. On July 1st of this year, in fact, I was authorized to expand Portland Street Response citywide. So you're talking about going from 4 workers to about 70 plus workers, and we're in the process of hiring and training. And again, Portland Street Response goal is not to go from call to call to call. It was created so that it could provide care to people where they are, when they need it.
If reelected, she plans to work system-wide to expand Portland Street Response to address the addiction and mental health crisis on our streets.
Your opponent in this race calls you the most radical member of City Council on these issues, and at times the most passive with respect to addressing unsheltered camps.
Not quite sure what my opponent means by that. I'm really clear about my role and my role of making sure that we are taking care of the people in the city of Portland. And that's why I've been focused on trying to remove barriers so that people can live their best lives.
If homelessness is someone's #1 concern, why should they vote for you?
If homelessness is their #1 concern, they should vote for me because I'm the only candidate that understands the economic cliff that workers are experiencing. I know what people are seeing who are fortunate enough to have homes is but for grace, but for a paycheck, but for a lost job, there go I. So someone who understands what it's like to be a working person, someone who understands how systems work, and I know we need all of them in order to address our crises on the street, which is houselessness.
Commissioner Hardesty also talked of housing the homeless in vacant buildings around the city and allocating $1 billion statewide for affordable housing. You can watch the full interview along with the one we did with Renee Gonzalez on KGW+. And a reminder, Election Day is November 8th. Blair Best, KGW News.
All right, thanks, Blair. And we want to pull back the curtain a little bit when we do stories like this to give you an inside look at how much time Blair got with each candidate, for example, and some of her takeaways after talking with each candidate. We asked her to talk about those things while she was still downtown earlier today. Take a look.
Hey Pat, joining you from outside City Hall. I wanted to share my takeaways with the two interviews with Hardesty and Gonzalez. I sat down with both of them for about 20 minutes. Last week we talked with Gonzalez, and the main takeaway from that interview is he really wants to make sure that people on the streets are being held accountable for any crime that they're committing, whether it's theft or vandalism. As for Hardesty, as she correctly noted in the interview, housing and homelessness isn't under her responsibilities as commissioner. But it was harder to see the direct response that she would take to this crisis. She had a lot of criticism for how the city is handling homelessness right now, but it was harder to find what she would specifically do to make a difference. When as for Gonzalez, it felt as if he had more concrete plans on what he would do to help tackle this crisis. Those are just my takeaways for what it's worth.
Still to come on The Story. It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. Clark County's hanging holiday of 1890.
Modern readers would say this has to be fiction, but no, it's absolutely true.
The story of a murder, trial, and execution turned public spectacle. We have a preview of the newest episode of KGW's Wicked West podcast, When the Story returns.
A new episode of KGW's podcast, Wicked West, is out today. The series dives into the mysterious Northwest folklore and infamous stories of old-timey crime, and in some cases, old-time consequences. In series number 2, we bring you the story of Clark County's hanging holiday of 1890.
Here he lies in the Old City Cemetery in Vancouver, Washington. Edward Gallagher. 4 words depict his life, or at least how it ended. Died by legal hanging, his headstone reads, July 11th, 1890, 27 years old.
The saying about Gallagher is that he's the only man legally hanged in Clark County.
Dubbed the hanging holiday of 1890, Gallagher's story has long fascinated historians and authors like Jeff Davis.
Modern readers would say this has to be fiction, but no, it's absolutely true.
Indeed it is, and it all began the year before Gallagher's public hanging. In 1889, a local farmer named Lewis Marr was found brutally murdered in a field on his property.
He had been bludgeoned with some sharp object and shot with either a rifle or a handgun, and also shot with a shotgun.
Marr's home had been ransacked. Authorities believed somebody targeted him for the cash he was known to stash around his farmhouse. Gallagher, a drifter and itinerant worker, had been spotted near Marr's farm prior to the murder. He was quickly apprehended by police. Inside Gallagher's pockets, police found items from Marr's home. And with that, Gallagher was arrested and set to go on trial for capital murder.
The ultimate punishment could well have been public execution of the defendant.
Gallagher pleaded insanity, but it took a jury less than 4 hours to convict him. His punishment, execution by hanging. Because Washington had just become a state in 1889, the year before the trial, there was no state penitentiary yet. Executions were left to individual counties to facilitate. Many would build scaffolding in the attics of courthouses, where they would hang prisoners from the highest point.
In the 1800s, they would actually kind of hold a lottery, and people would volunteer to be the public executioner, and then they would pick the name out of the hat, and they would receive a fee also as a public executioner.
For Gallagher's hanging, the local sheriff was selected as executioner and received a $50 stipend, about $1,500 by today's standards. The total cost of the execution and construction of the scaffolding was said to top $225, a large sum for a county with the population of only 5,000 people. So officials came up with a unique idea to help foot the bill. They turned the event into a public spectacle and sold 200 tickets to townspeople. It essentially became a celebration of death, thus the name, the hanging holiday.
It was not a solemn occasion. It was, if you've ever seen movies where it's a public holiday, that's exactly what it was. People brought their kids there and they had picnics waiting for it.
200 ticket holders surrounded the makeshift gallows erected at the courthouse square. As many as 300 additional onlookers lined up outside the 50 by 80 foot stockade built to shield the gallows. Some reportedly hoisted their children onto their shoulders to get a peek inside. They all anxiously watched as the sheriff walked Gallagher up 13 steps to the top of the scaffold. When they reached the top, Gallagher tried to make a run for it.
And so he tried escaping, and the sheriff and all of his guards had to wrestle him to the ground. And that went on for several minutes.
Witnesses say Gallagher fought like a demon. It took 7 men to subdue him. Ultimately, Gallagher's resistance would not be enough to change his fate.
They finally stood him upright on the trapdoor, put the noose around his neck and the hood on him, and the sheriff asked him one last time, did you kill him? And Gallagher finally replied, none of your damn business. And it was shortly after that they pulled the lever, pulled the key, opened the trapdoor, and Gallagher dropped to his death.
After the event's conclusion, the crowd scattered. Some even took strands from the noose as souvenirs. A local newspaper later decried the public nature of the hanging as a disgrace to the community, calling on the county to never hold a similar execution again. Gallagher's body was buried at Vancouver's Old City Cemetery in what's called a potter's field. It's where the unclaimed, the unknown, and the poor are laid to rest. For decades, Gallagher's grave remained unmarked, until one day, an anonymous citizen purchased the very headstone that exists today.
How about that? Fascinating and disturbing all at the same time. This is the second of 6 stories about the dark history of the Pacific Northwest. For the full stories, look for Wicked West wherever you get your podcast. Next week, we'll learn about Vancouver's Interstate Bridge ghost. Stay with us. The story returns right after this. For our Hey Help profile this week, we're talking about the KGW Great Toy Drive. Last year, with your help, we donated over 30,000 toys to local kids. This year, we're back at it and we're raising the bar. Head to kgw.com/toy to sign up. And a special shout out tonight to Todd Construction in Southwest Portland. Way to go, signing up early. All right, keep sending your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. We'll wrap things up right after this. Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, the story, our story, well, that never ends.